Hello and welcome to the fourth podcast, Infection Control, Experts in Conversation, hosted by Innovos. The podcasts, with the help of national experts, aim to support IP&C teams in the real NHS world by offering advice and suggesting pragmatic solutions to drive down healthcare-associated infection, and all evidence-based, of course. My name is Liz Waters, a recently retired consultant nurse with 22 years experience in the IP&C world. I know how tough it is out there, having managed a range of IP&C issues in a very large health board. And so to our next podcast, which focuses on infection prevention and control in the built environment. Such an important topic when taking into account the significant risks associated with air, waters and surfaces. It is no secret that outbreaks of pathogens with associated deaths have been identified in new and old estate, so we need to get this right. New hospitals currently being built brings huge opportunities to provide state-of-the-art facilities with IP&C in mind, and clearly attention is also needed in upgrading old estate and introducing 21st century IP&C technology such as UVC and air purification systems. To unpick all of this, I'm delighted to welcome Alyson Prince, an independent senior consultant technical advisor. Alyson is an expert in infection control practice with over 14 years of experience in shaping the built environment. Her expert knowledge and insight provide key stakeholders at all stages of project development a clear understanding of the critical requirements of infection prevention and control standards and policies to ensure patient safety within the NHS. Welcome, Alyson.
Thank you for having me.
It's great having you on board. I have to say, I find that the whole world of infection control in the built environment absolutely fascinating, and as I've outlined already, just so important. Alyson, you've been involved in this complex engineering world for some time now, and I know that you are acutely aware of some of the serious outbreaks associated with new builds. Can you give us a brief description of any that stand out and the learning associated with the outbreaks?
I've recently been involved in several different projects where the specifications haven't been amended and risk reviewed through the commissioning and design process. So, for example, they'll start off in a new build with a specification that meets all the guidance, but actually doesn't adhere to the clinical risk profile of the patients. And you get to the end of the project, things will have been cut out because they didn't understand or translate into the clinical risk of the patient. That actually then becomes harmful to the patient group that occupies the building. So things like ventilation and air change rates, but also temperatures and control and storage of water on site for water hygiene methods also impact and increase the potential of outbreaks in that building as a result of those poor mitigation measures that have been put in place. And it's not one single point of failure. It's more of a multiple points of failure that have conversely, aligned to produce these problems and these risks. So an outbreak of, they had a Cuprivardis populus outbreak as a result of water hygiene. Now, Cuprivardis is very closely related microbiologically to Pseudomonas. So you can imagine in the way that Pseudomonas would occupy a water system, Cuprivardis could occupy a water system. And the patients that were affected in this were immunocompromised patients. And that is the problem. These buildings are not just public buildings. They are buildings that house very susceptible and very immunocompromised patients. And the risks that are attached to things like air and water have very, very serious consequences if you get them wrong. And that's the thing about understanding the whole process from concept to completion, because actually if you go through the stages with the designers and actually highlight those clinical risks, then you can avoid those mistakes being made. But it's only through having those conversations, and often, as you said yourself, Liz, it's constraints of resource and time that IP&C can't devote to these projects. that causes some of this issue, where there's gaps in consistency of input, can also factor into the cause of these outbreaks. And as we've seen, they have quite serious implications and can end up having, public inquiries as a result. There's various different coroner's inquests going on across the countries around the outbreaks and the harm that has been done to patients. And I think as IPC, we have a duty to cause no harm, and we need to sort of go back into this discipline of infection control that isn't very well explored, and sort of pick up where our role is really. I think it's really, really critical.
I think what strikes me, Alyson, is it's not just the time constraints of allowing IP&C nurses to input on new builds. It's also about their knowledge as well, and it is complex. And we had a chat, before we started recording this podcast, and I think we're both in agreement that we do need to develop a whole cohort of IP&C nurses who've undergone some kind of module or some kind of accreditation in advising on the IP&C requirements in a new build hospital, right from the start. And again, we had a very interesting conversation, didn't we, about being involved right at the start. So I'd be interested in what you have to say about that.
I think as IPC, we, and I was just as guilty of it until I undertook the role in 2011, of just kind of looking at the patient and the patient focus, and how do we make sure we wash our hands, and all of the kind of key things were taught. And even when I did my infection control course, there wasn't an awful lot in there about the built environment, to the point where I didn't quite understand it. So I can understand where people are coming from if they haven't got the knowledge. And yes, I agree with you. Like I said, there needs to be we teach people about surgical site infections. We teach people about epidemiology. We teach people about, all different aspects of infection control. And as IPC nurses, we practitioners, we understand that it goes across the whole spectrum of the building. So why would we not include this as a discipline? And I think, actually coming back to your point of where we need to be involved, there are things that happen, like business cases, where we initially plan, before we even get to putting a shovel in the ground. There is discussions at a strategic level about how to design, is this building needed? Do we need this building? Why do we need this building? What is the intention? And actually, what is the resource allocation? And I think, having discussed it with my peers, actually, the resource allocation is a really important part for IPC to be involved in. Because if you get a building that's, I don't know, say for instance, a cancer centre, actually the resource allocation for ventilation is really critical for that building. And if it's not planned for at the beginning, it's very hard to retrospectively introduce increased isolation facilities or PPVL rooms or decat space for your BMT, because you need to verify those ventilation rooms every year annually, because it's classified as specialist ventilation. So isolation room is classified as specialist ventilation, and it needs to be verified by an engineer annually. And so therefore you need a space that you need to put those patients in whilst that's being done. But obviously they're really, really compromised, very, vulnerable patient group. So you need a safe place for them to go whilst that's being undertaken. And I think those discussions around footprint and space and money happen very, very early on. Before, the HBN 0009, the infection control in built environment, doesn't actually stipulate infection control to get involved until stage 2, which is the design sort of spatial coordination, design development, early stages. But actually, I would say stage 0, you need to have those conversations about the risk profile of the building. And then you go on to the next steps of thinking about, actually planning the the site and the stuff around site control, so access to egress, but also where they're going to source their water. I was involved in a project recently about they were sourcing their water supply from a bore well. What is the water quality going to be coming in, and is that going to affect the building when it comes to fruition? Are you going to have mitigation measures in place? So having sight of those plans and that business case and that strategic outlook will give you some shape and form to actually kind of prevent or preempt some of the risks. And it may be that there isn't any risks and maybe you don't need to be involved, but actually from a senior infection control point of view, you need to have an understanding of where your developmental control plan is headed. So developmental control plan is almost like a master plan for the whole campus of your organization. If you've got big hospital, for instance, and they'll say, well, we're going to knock this building down and then we're going to build this one, and then we'll do that in phase 1 and we'll do this in phase 2. You need to understand what those steps are, because that will have an impact on how you use the buildings around you, what the risk profile for the patients in the other buildings are. I was involved in a project that we commissioned, and they were demolishing the building beside it. And the building that I was involved in was a cancer centre. So the air intakes for the ventilation were increasingly dirty and compromised with concrete dust, which, as we know, So what did we have to do? Well, we had to look at our filters. We had to change them more often. We had to increase our fan speeds on the ventilation, because that's where the intakes for the building were, and we couldn't change that. But actually, we could mitigate some of that risk. And I think that's never really considered. People, and even when IP&C do get involved, they get involved in the designs, but lots of the things are already decided at that point. So I think we need to be aware and have some education. We need education.
So I'm mindful, sort of from a new build perspective, that ventilation and the management of water is clearly absolutely crucial. But you will know from conversations that we've had how passionate I am about the cleanliness of the environment, and for me it makes absolute sense that we actually build in technology. So instead of wheeling the UVC machine, we actually into the rooms. They're already in the ceiling. They're all already fitted there, which gives us so many opportunities to decontaminate that room. If a patient goes down to X-ray, then we can get the cleaners up, get the room cleaned, and the switch pulled to UVC that room. And of course, Innovos has got the technology to sort of make that happen. Yeah. Do you feel that is an opportunity as well for our new build hospitals, Alyson?
Absolutely, especially given that we're going down the single room route, where we know that actually it takes longer to clean some of these rooms, because essentially you're dividing up the space into individual areas. I think UV into the ceilings is an ideal opportunity for that to happen, because again, like you said, it reduces down the surface contamination in the space, and allows us to kind of minimize the risk of the environment. As we know, the environment poses to the patients who are vulnerable, who will be there for quite a long time generally. And I think it's an ideal opportunity that we need to have those conversations now. Absolutely, where we're looking to build new hospitals, and where we're looking to bring in, we're all talking about digital, and we're all talking about, how digital can improve the care pathway. Actually, we should be using technology to improve the cleanliness and the hygiene levels in our hospitals. So yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a really, really pivotal point, and something that really needs to happen. And those discussions need to be held with the right people right now, where we're having this new hospital program build brought online.
Absolutely. What's your thought about old estates? I know that there is a lot of talk in social media about whether COVID is airborne or not. But even if we take COVID out of the equation, we do have a significant number of old NHS hospitals which are working on neutral ventilation. Again, do you feel that we can mitigate risk significantly by installing air purification systems to reduce the risk of respiratory infection as such?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think if you've got an old estate, then you have to risk mitigate, and one of those measures would be to choose an air purification module to help you with some of those air change rates that you can't achieve in spaces, you know. And if you look back at the old estate, actually it was quite airtight, so there wasn't the capacity to open windows. There isn't the capacity to ventilate, even if it was. So natural ventilation is not standardized ventilation in terms of the way mechanical ventilation is. So you get some air change, but you wouldn't get it consistently through the process. So I think air purification can support some of that risk mitigation in the old estate. I don't think it's the answer of the whole thing. I think it's a measure that you can bring in. And you also need to have, if you do bring in an air purification module, you need to have it maintained regularly, because obviously, as we've seen, that some of those filters then obviously can become quite dirty and end up being a source of contamination themselves. So I think you can bring it in, and you need to know about the space of your room and how many air change rates you get from that module. There is a really, really good website created by Harvard, actually, that helps you to calculate your air change rates based on the module that you've got. And I think that, you know, if you've not got anything else, you know, if you can't retrofit a ventilation system into your building, then you've got to mitigate the risks. You're still bound by the Health and Social Care Act to maintain a clean and safe environment. And that's part of maintaining a safe environment, is to ensure that you've got that air change rates and purification to protect not just your patients, but actually your staff. You know, you've got a duty under the Health and Safety Executive to protect your workers in their employee as a HSE executive mandate. So yeah, I do agree. Air purification is one aspect of the fight against some of the older estate. But again, all of it's a risk assessment, and it's making that risk assessment.
It is. And I suppose I remember being extremely frustrated when the guidance, the COVID guidance came through that said that we had to open the windows to ventilate. But our windows opened 4 inches.
Yeah, it's not consistent. You never ventilate a deeper room. So the deeper the building, the less ventilation. Because if you look at Florence Nightingale, what they had was cross ventilation. So you had both sides of the building opened windows at both ends. There was no temperature control. There was no, you know, you put blankets up and you had some ventilation. I think people think natural ventilation is a panacea, but actually it's not. And actually it's really inconsistent. And in a place where you have high risk patients, it's really quite dangerous to assume that just natural ventilation will get you by, because it just won't. And you know, it's been proven out in COVID outbreaks of buildings that have no ventilation because they were built in the 60s. Actually, they had massive outbreaks. You know, the literature is out there. They've had massive outbreaks. I know of at least 2 that they just rip through. And as IP&C will have seen it, you know, they start at one end and they rip through the building until it burns itself out. So, you know, I think we need to be more considerate of how our environment. I think COVID has brought that to the fore. I think it was always there, but I think COVID has shone a light on that a bit more now.
Absolutely, it has. Absolutely. I think it has really sparked everyone's attention into looking at ventilation. So it's going to be really interesting to see how hospitals move forward in making their old estate as safe as possible. And I think what strikes me about putting these air purification systems into old estate is that you've got a bit of a win-win situation, because if you're preventing cross-transmission of respiratory viruses from staff to patients, you're also doing it the other way around. And of course, that will also benefit staff sickness, of course. You know, the more we can prevent respiratory infections in our staff, the less staff we'll have going off sick. So we've got a few win-win situations going on there if we get the ventilation right.
Yeah, and I think a piece of work I did with the Nuffield Trust on lessons learned from COVID. Actually, we went around the country and spoke to various different hospitals around what were their key lessons, and actually staff spaces were one of the key lessons. You know, how staff gathered to eat lunch, and you know, they were the sources of the outbreaks. You know, they were transmitting it between areas, and then we're going to have lunch, and nurse from Ward A went to lunch with nurse from Ward B, and nurse from Ward B brought it back to Ward B, and Ward B then had an outbreak. And it's not, we need to consider our waiting areas, we need to consider our staff rest spaces, you know, our outpatient clinics. We reviewed how outpatients was used completely in COVID, but actually that was way overdue. We should have been talking about that before COVID hit, because actually everybody was just gathering in these, you know, small clinic spaces as waiting areas, and they were becoming like almost like GP surgeries where everyone brought everything to it and swapped it all around. Similarly with ED departments, you know, they entered into the ED department and it was transmitted before they went up to the ward while they were incubating it in the open bay, and then they went off to the side room, you know. So I think where we became more wise in COVID was the patient pathway and how people came in and out of the buildings. And I think we need to take that learning forward now in how we design and use our spaces.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're in a very exciting space, to be quite honest, Alyson.
I don't know, my hair's colours will tell you differently.
I think what worries me more than anything is that I think we're person dependent on people like you at the moment, and I don't think there's many of you. And I really feel that the IP&C world need to really understand that and expand, as we've discussed already, expand that cohort of experts in this area. So I think, to sort of summarize, really, I think you've really pushed the point about how important it is for IP&C to be involved right from the start, and the need to really push engineering and technology, not only in our new hospitals, but in our old hospitals as well. Alyson, I'm sure there'll be IP&C nurses out there who would really like to tap into your expertise. So are you willing to let us have your contact details that we can put on the Innovos website, if that's all right?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'm always up for a chat. I think, you know, we've got to think about the challenges coming down the road, some of which are around sustainability and energy use in our buildings and how they translate into the risks for our patients. You know, thinking about what is a low risk and high risk space. And there's lots that there's lots of challenges. Antimicrobial resistance is another one, and how we use antibiotics in our areas. So I think there's lots and lots to be discussed. So I'm more than happy for you to share my details and for to be contacted and have those discussions. Yeah, no problem.
But in the meantime, any IP&C nurse who wants to explore the range of technology through Innovos, you know, please contact us. You know, we've got the technology out there. We've got the air purification systems. We've got the Ultra V Connect. We've got the HPV systems, the DPROC systems. So contact us. We can help. We can help you, whether you are advising on a new hospital or whether you're looking to mitigate risk in your old estate. Alyson, that has been absolutely fantastic. I think it is such a fascinating subject, And I've often said this, that, you know, I'm retired now, so I want to know that the hospitals I will be admitted to in the not too distant future are fit for purpose, and knowing that there are people like you around who are advising on such hospitals makes me sleep better in my bed. But we just need more of you. So.
Yeah, we do. And it's for the patient. At the end of the day, everything we do is for the patient in that bed.
Absolutely.
It's, you know, it's for them, to be a voice for them, because, you know, they don't have a voice. They are at the behest of what we do to them and where they are. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, patient first and foremost.
Yeah.
Organisational reputation is at risk if we don't
Yeah.
get it right as well.
Yeah.
So just a really important podcast, and thank you so much.
No problem.
Hopefully we'll catch up soon.
Thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You're welcome.